North Texas-based Ministries, who have collected hundreds of millions of dollars from followers, are under investigation. A U.S. Senator wants the financial records of Kenneth Copeland and Benny Hinn Ministries.
The thing that's marvelous about sowing seed.
Imagine believing that if you gave faithfully enough, spoke the right words, and trusted without doubt, your life would change forever. For millions, that wasn't just hope, it was a promise they believed came straight from Kenneth Copeland. But over the years, some followers began comparing those promises with what actually happened. As headlines grew louder, viral interviews spread online, and public declarations faced new scrutiny, many started asking whether they had misunderstood the message, or whether the message itself deserved a closer look. This story isn't just about one preacher, it's about trust, influence, and what happens when belief collides with reality. Long before Kenneth Copeland became the face of one of the world's largest televangelist ministries, he was simply a man searching for direction. In the 1960s, he committed his life to Christian ministry and soon became associated with the growing Word of Faith movement. His preaching style was different from many pastors of his time. He spoke with confidence, certainty, and the belief that faith could change every part of a person's life. That message quickly found an audience. As television entered more homes across America, Copeland recognized an opportunity. His sermons were no longer limited to church buildings. They reached living rooms across the country and eventually around the world. Through books, conferences, television broadcasts, and Kenneth Copeland Ministries, his influence expanded year after year. Thousands attended his events in person, while millions watched from home. To many followers, he wasn't just another preacher. He was a trusted voice who seemed certain that God's promises were available to anyone willing to believe. At the center of his message was a simple idea. Faith wasn't meant to stay inside a church service. It could transform everyday life. According to Copeland's teaching, faith could affect health, relationships, finances, and even the words people spoke each day. For countless believers facing sickness, debt, or personal struggles, that message offered hope when hope seemed hard to find. But as his ministry grew larger, expectations grew with it. The more confidence he spoke with, the more people believed the promises would produce real-world results. That confidence helped build one of the most successful ministries in modern Christianity, yet it also laid the foundation for the questions that would follow years later. Because when extraordinary promises meet real life, people eventually begin asking whether those promises were ever meant to work the way they were presented. And that brings us to the message that made Kenneth Copeland famous and the debate that still divides Christians today. At the heart of Kenneth Copeland's ministry was one message that set him apart from many other Christian leaders. It wasn't just about going to church or praying more. It was about expecting God to change every part of your life. Copeland taught that faith was more than belief. It was a spiritual force that, when spoken and acted upon, could bring healing, success, and financial blessing. To millions of followers, this wasn't just encouraging, it was life-changing. One of his most well-known teachings centered on what became known as seed faith. The idea was simple. Just as a farmer plants a seed expecting a harvest, believers could give financially in faith while trusting God to bless them in return. Copeland often taught that generosity opened the door for God's provision and that faith-filled giving was connected to receiving future blessings. For many supporters, this message brought hope during difficult seasons. They shared testimonies of answered prayers, restored finances, and personal breakthroughs. To them, Copeland wasn't selling false hope. He was teaching biblical principles that had transformed their own lives. But critics saw the message very differently. Many pastors and theologians argued that the Bible never guarantees wealth in exchange for financial giving. They pointed to the lives of Jesus, the apostles, and early Christians who often experienced hardship rather than material success. Some also questioned whether vulnerable viewers, especially those facing financial struggles, could feel pressure to give beyond their means while believing a miracle was just around the corner. As the debate intensified, major news organizations and investigative programs began taking a closer look at the prosperity movement. What they uncovered would bring Kenneth Copeland's ministry under a level of public scrutiny unlike anything it had faced before. And once the cameras started rolling, the controversy was no longer confined to church walls. For years, most of Kenneth Copeland's biggest debates stayed inside Christian circles. Pastors disagreed with his teachings, Bible scholars challenged his interpretation of Scripture. Supporters defended him, saying his message had changed countless lives. But as his ministry continued to grow, the conversation moved beyond churches and into national news. Major television networks and investigative journalists began asking questions that many viewers had never considered before. They looked at the rapid growth of prosperity ministries, the fundraising appeals, and the luxurious lifestyles of some of their leaders. Kenneth Copeland's ministry was often at the center of those reports. One of the biggest questions was simple: should a preacher live like this? News reports highlighted ministry-owned aircraft, luxury homes, and a lifestyle that looked very different from the humble image many people associated with Christian ministry. Critics argued that such wealth appeared difficult to reconcile with biblical teachings about humility and sacrifice. Supporters responded that the ministry's success reflected decades of growth, worldwide outreach, and generous supporters who chose to give voluntarily. The discussion reached a wider audience when journalists began interviewing former followers, theologians, and ministry representatives. Some former supporters said they had started questioning promises they once accepted without hesitation. Others insisted Copeland's teachings had strengthened their faith and helped them through life's hardest moments. Then another issue began attracting even more attention. Critics pointed to several public statements and prophetic declarations that they believed had not unfolded as expected. Supporters argued those statements were being misunderstood, taken out of context, or interpreted too literally. The debate quickly intensified, and people on both sides demanded answers. But none of those earlier controversies would prepare Kenneth Copeland for the moment that would make headlines around the world. By early 2020, the world was facing a crisis unlike anything seen in decades. Countries were shutting down, hospitals were filling, families were separated. Fear spread almost as quickly as the virus itself. During that uncertain time, millions turned to religious leaders for comfort and guidance. Kenneth Copeland was one of them. In a televised broadcast that quickly spread far beyond his regular audience, Copeland spoke directly to the pandemic. Standing before the cameras, he declared that the virus had been defeated through the power of God. In another widely shared moment, he dramatically declared that he was blowing the wind of God against COVID-19. Within hours, clips from the broadcast were appearing across television news programs, social media platforms, and websites around the world. Supporters saw something very different from what many critics saw. They believed Copeland was praying boldly during a time of fear and demonstrating confidence in God's power. To them, his words were an expression of faith, not a medical prediction or government policy. Critics, however, argued that the declarations created unrealistic expectations because the pandemic continued to spread long after the broadcasts aired. News organizations replayed the clips while discussing the growing health crisis, and commentators questioned whether such public statements could confuse or mislead vulnerable audiences searching for hope during an emergency. The controversy soon grew beyond the broadcasts themselves. It reopened older questions that had followed Copeland's ministry for years. If spoken declarations were presented as powerful enough to change reality, what should people conclude when reality appeared unchanged? Was this an example of unwavering faith being misunderstood, or did it expose a deeper problem with the promises being made? Before those questions could settle, another interview would put Kenneth Copeland back in front of the cameras. This time, it wasn't about faith healing or the pandemic. It was about private jets and one answer that would be replayed across the world for years to come. By the time the pandemic controversy began to fade from the headlines, Kenneth Copeland's ministry had already spent years facing questions about another subject: money. More specifically, the attention centered on the ministry's use of private aircraft. For supporters, the explanation seemed straightforward. Kenneth Copeland Ministries traveled extensively, held conferences around the world, and managed a global media operation. Flying privately, they argued, allowed ministry work to continue efficiently, safely, and without the scheduling limits of commercial airlines. Critics weren't convinced. As questions about ministry finances grew louder, television journalists sought direct answers. Then came the interview that would become one of the most widely shared moments of Copeland's public life. When asked why he didn't simply fly on commercial airlines, Copeland offered an explanation that immediately captured public attention. He described commercial flights as like traveling in a long tube with a bunch of demons. The remark spread rapidly across news broadcasts, talk shows, and social media platforms around the world. For many viewers who had never heard of Kenneth Copeland before, this became their first introduction to him. Supporters later argued that the comment was being interpreted too literally. They said Copeland was referring to the constant interruptions, demands, and pressures that came with public travel, rather than claiming every passenger was evil. Critics, however, viewed the explanation as another example of a ministry leader appearing disconnected from the everyday experiences of the people who supported him. The interview also renewed interest in reports about private aircraft, luxury properties, and fundraising practices. News organizations revisited earlier investigations, while online discussions exploded with debate. Some defended Copeland's right to use ministry resources as he believed appropriate. Others questioned whether such displays of wealth matched the message he preached from the pulpit. But the growing controversy wasn't just about airplanes or expensive lifestyles. Beneath every headline was a deeper issue: trust. Because once people began questioning where the money was going, many started asking an even more uncomfortable question: what exactly had they been asked to believe in the first place? As Kenneth Copeland's ministry expanded, so did its fundraising. Television broadcasts, conferences, books, and donation campaigns became a familiar part of the ministry's outreach. Viewers were often encouraged to support the ministry financially, with teachings that giving in faith could be connected to receiving God's blessings. For many supporters, this wasn't viewed as pressure. It was seen as an opportunity to participate in God's work and trust Him for provision. Thousands of followers have shared stories of personal breakthroughs after embracing these teachings. They speak of debts paid off, unexpected opportunities, restored relationships, and renewed hope. These testimonies remain one of the strongest reasons many supporters continue to stand behind Copeland today. But critics asked a different question. They argued that testimonies alone could not prove the promises being made. Some former followers said they gave sacrificially for years, believing financial miracles would follow, only to find themselves struggling with disappointment when life did not unfold as they expected. Critics also questioned whether repeated fundraising appeals could lead some viewers to believe that larger donations would result in greater blessings, even though life often brings outcomes that no one can predict. These concerns attracted attention from investigative journalists and religious scholars who examined the broader prosperity gospel movement, rather than Kenneth Copeland alone. Their reports explored the relationship between fundraising, faith, and accountability, while noting that supporters viewed generous giving as a voluntary expression of trust, rather than a guaranteed path to wealth. At the center of the debate was a difficult question that still divides Christians today. When a ministry teaches that faith and giving can unlock God's blessings, how should those promises be understood when the expected results do not always come? Is the problem a lack of faith, a misunderstanding of the teaching, or a message that critics believe promised more than Scripture actually guarantees? As these questions spread beyond church walls, another challenge emerged, this time from pastors, theologians, and Bible scholars who argued that the disagreement wasn't just about money. They believed it reached the very heart of what the Bible teaches about faith, suffering, and the Christian life. By now, the debate surrounding Kenneth Copeland had grown far beyond television interviews and news headlines. It had become one of the biggest theological disagreements in modern Christianity. The question was no longer just about money or private jets. It was about whether Copeland's message reflected what the Bible actually teaches. Many respected pastors, Bible teachers, and Christian scholars openly challenged the prosperity gospel. They argued that while God can bless people in many ways, Scripture does not promise that every faithful believer will become healthy, wealthy, or financially successful. They pointed to the lives of Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and the early Christians, many of whom endured hardship, persecution, imprisonment, and poverty despite their unwavering faith. Critics also questioned teachings about positive confession. For many years, criticism of Kenneth Copeland came mostly from theologians, investigative journalists, and a handful of former followers. But the rise of social media changed everything. A single interview, a short sermon clip, or a viral broadcast could reach millions of people in just a few hours. Suddenly, debates that once stayed inside church circles became global conversations. The private jet interview was replayed countless times. The COVID-19 broadcasts were clipped and shared across platforms. News reports, reaction videos, and online discussions introduced Kenneth Copeland to audiences who had never watched one of his sermons. For some viewers, those short clips became the entire story. For others, they were the starting point for deeper research into his ministry. At the same time, more former followers began speaking publicly about why they had left the prosperity gospel movement. Their experiences varied. Some said they struggled after believing financial breakthroughs would follow their giving. Others described theological disagreements that gradually changed their understanding of Scripture. Many emphasized that their concerns were not about faith itself, but about teachings they no longer believed reflected the Bible accurately. Supporters pushed back just as strongly. They argued that short, viral clips often removed important context, and critics ignored decades of ministry work, humanitarian efforts, and testimonies from people whose lives they believed had been transformed. They also pointed out that online controversy rewards the most dramatic moments, making it easy for a few seconds of video to overshadow years of preaching. The result was a growing divide. One side saw Kenneth Copeland as a faithful minister unfairly targeted by the media. The other viewed him as the most recognizable face of a movement they believed had promised far more than it could ever deliver. And that leaves one final question. After decades of influence, worldwide attention, and relentless controversy, what does Kenneth Copeland's story ultimately reveal? Not just about one preacher, but about the growing relationship between faith, influence, wealth, and accountability in the modern world. After decades in the public eye, Kenneth Copeland remains one of the most influential and one of the most debated religious figures in modern America. His ministry continues to reach audiences around the world. His supporters still point to testimonies of changed lives, answered
prayers, and spiritual encouragement as evidence that his message continues to make a difference. Yet, the controversies have never fully disappeared. The prosperity gospel continues to divide churches. His public declarations during the COVID-19 pandemic are still replayed years later. The interview about private jets remains one of the most recognizable moments of his career. News investigations, theological criticism, and online discussions have ensured that the questions surrounding his ministry continue long after the headlines faded. Throughout this documentary, we've looked at documented broadcasts, media investigations, public interviews, and the ongoing debate surrounding Kenneth Copeland's teachings. What those sources reveal is not a simple story with easy answers. They reveal a ministry that inspired extraordinary loyalty while also attracting extraordinary criticism. Some critics believe repeated promises about prosperity, healing, and faith created expectations that real life could not always fulfill. Supporters reject that conclusion, arguing that his words have often been misunderstood, taken out of context, or judged by standards that ignore the role of personal faith. Those two perspectives continue to shape the conversation today. Perhaps the biggest lesson isn't about one man alone. It's about what happens whenever a public figure speaks with certainty on behalf of God. People don't simply hear those words. They build decisions, hopes, finances, and even their futures around them. That is why questions of accountability carry such weight, regardless of where someone stands in the debate. And maybe that's the question every viewer should leave with. If millions can place complete trust in one voice, how should those claims be examined when they collide with reality? Where is the line between sincere conviction, mistaken prediction, and responsibility to the people who believed? Because Kenneth Copeland's story may not be the end of this conversation. It may only be the beginning.